Welcome, everyone, to the Africa-China Initiative webinar series. Today, we're very, very pleased to be able to present a new book just out, I believe, or coming in a few weeks. Is a book by Emeka Umejei on China in African media. Um, in addition to Dr. Umejei, we also have two discussants. Let me introduce them to you briefly. After I say welcome again, my name is Yoon Park. I'm the program director of the Africa China Initiative here at Georgetown University, where I also teach a course on China's evolving role in Africa. I'm very, very excited to host this panel in particular because we all have connections to Johannesburg, which is where all three of our speakers are joining us from. And not just Johannesburg, but to the University of the Witwatersrand or WITS. Again, I'm very, very excited to host this panel. Our speaker and the author of the book, China and African Media, is currently a senior research associate in the Department of Communications and Media at the University of Johannesburg. And he received his PhD from WITS in media studies and worked formally as a journalist. He's been here in the United States on fellowship in Washington, D.C., so we were neighbors briefly. And he just returned to Johannesburg from a fellowship at the Academia Sinica in Taiwan. First discussant is Eugenio Gagliardoni, who is professor of media studies at the University of the Witwatersrand, studying the evolution of distinctive models of information society in the global South, particularly in Africa. And then our good friend Bob Wakeza, who is director of the African Center for the Study of the U.S., also at the University of the Witwatersrand. Bob is also a former journalist, and his teaching, research, and public engagement focuses on African geopolitics, again, with a focus on media, communications, and digital technologies. So we're really, really excited to hear about Emeka's new book and hear what our experts have to say about it. So, Emeka, let me please hand over to you.
Thank you so very much. Let me share my slide. So I prepared a very brief slide for this book talk. So the title of my book, which was published on March 5th, 2026, with Bloomsbury Academic, it's China in African Media, between Influence Operations and Decolonization. China has been in African media, but this is an engaging debate because recently the Xinhua Institute published a very, very bold document on decolonization, and they were claiming to lead that decolonization in Africa. So one of the central questions of this book is, will China's multifaceted engagement in African media, will it result in the decolonization of African media and journalism, or will it be just part of its propaganda in Africa? And then, so I start. It's not matter. Okay, so they are broadly to this book. It's one, you have telling China's story well, which is about propaganda, the PRC's propaganda in the media in Africa and around the world, sanctioned narrative of the CCP, and state-centric messaging. This is telling China's story well. Then we have, international communication system, which was proposed at I think that was the third plenum in July 2023 or 2024. They thought about evolving an international communication system, which is decolonial, diversified, and mutual. In furtherance of the international communication system, the Xinhua Institute also published a a very strong document on, decolonizing the mind. So, but the question is it possible to serve two masters? Is it possible to, um, promote propaganda and to decolonize at the same time the African media? Because propaganda and decolonization are two different things entirely. If you want to do propaganda, it's difficult for you to decolonize, because you want to do propaganda, it's about your messaging, it's about censored narratives, about the government. So it becomes difficult for you to do propaganda, which is to tell China's story well, and to decolonize the media in Africa, because both are oppositional and mutually exclusive. So this is the foundation, the overarching question of this book that underpins this book. So the overarching research question is: does China's multimodal engagement in African media amount to propaganda, or does it offer the opportunity for the decolonization of African media? Then the methodology, I did extensive semi-structured interviews with journalists in 14 African countries, and also did content analysis of policy documents and published accounts in the public domain. So let's look at some of China's multimodal engagement in African media. Chinese media expansion in Africa. Chinese media is expanding across the African continent. There's partnership between organs of the CCP and local media outlets in Africa. The Belt and Road News Network and the Belt and Road News Alliance. There's Chinese-funded media exchanges for African journalists. There's media partnership and content sharing agreements, media forums for alliances, and access to satellite TV for 10,000 villages, which is Chinese digital satellite TV. This is the multimodal engagement of the PRC in African media. Then I just take a bit. We look at the Chinese-funded media exchanges. What does it entail? It has broadly three categories: short-term, long-term, which is professional track, and scholars track. But what underpins it is largely geopolitical rivalry with the West. Introduce African journalists to the concept of positive reporting. And then we look at the media partnership and content sharing agreements. And I identify some of these to be Chinese state media to state media organizations in Africa. Like, Xinhua has content sharing agreement with many of the news agencies in Africa. We have the Chinese state media to private media organization. Xinhua also has content sharing agreement with, private media organizations in Africa. We have Chinese missions to African media organizations. We have content sharing agreements to partnership between Chinese missions in Africa and African media organizations. Then Chinese donations to investment in local media. It's very, very popular. Then when I looked at this part, I used certain stories, certain events in African media, like IUU, which is illegal unregulated fishing in Sierra Leone, Galamsey incident in Ghana, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and the termination of standard newspapers advertising revenue. So I looked at decolonizing African journalism practices. I used a framework developed by Moyo 2022, which identified 5 functions. 1, to unmask the coloniality of knowledge, to build a multicultural theory, to create an intercultural trans-epistemic dialogue, and attain social and cognitive justice, and rehumanizing journalism practices. But the colonial is local. It cannot be imported from outside of Africa. So that is one of the biggest questions, So China's role in African media, it will be difficult for it to result in declaration because it's all about China. It's not multicultural. It's ideological. It's about PRC's economic and political interests in Africa. It's not even about Africa. It does not even take into cognizance the African lived realities. Talk about Ubuntu, talk about any of those, African known concepts. It doesn't take those into cognizance. It's about the PRC, it's about positive reporting. It's about geopolitical rivalry. It's about the PRC getting a foothold in African media. So mostly it's not about the African people. It's not about, it does not take into cognizance how how it affects the African people. No, it's taking into consideration about, it's all about the PRC's economic and political interests in Africa. So it's not decolonization. Rather, I would say it's about telling China's story well in African media. And telling China's story well in African media is not colonial, it's not decolonial, it's ideological, and it's not multilateral, but about China on equal, what I often call on equal equals. Even though they frame this narrative as mutuality, mutual partners, but they're not. It's, two people who are in a relationship who are unequal. Why one is pretending to just trying to let you feel comfortable, that if I don't worry, we're equal, but they're not equal. Then my conclusion is one of the greatest debate, that's come out of issues of decolonization in Africa, of African journalism, is who will fund the decolonization of African journalism, stroke media. If the PRC funds it, what does it stand to gain? Nothing. It does not serve its geopolitical interests. So it will never fund such, it will not fund the decolonization of African journalism, stroke media. It's not in the PRC's interest to do so. It's in the PR's interest to ensure that it's able to influence the African media, so that its censored narrative will have dominance, in African media. That's what it is. So Africa must fund the decolonization of African media. It doesn't have to come from external, it doesn't have to come from outside of Africa. A homegrown African media is critical to decolonization. Then a decolonized curriculum that captures African reality is very, very important to make this happen. So this was a summary of the book, because if I put in a slide, it's going to be too long. So I just said in a brief summary, and I believe that my discussants are already, they have read through the book. So I believe as we engage more debates will emerge, and then I'm always here by the grace of God to do my own bits. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Emeka, so much. It was much briefer than I had expected, but as you said, perhaps we can take the opportunity to have this more of a conversation. So let me turn first to our first discussant, Inyo Gagliardone.
So actually, thank you for that, because that's what I was going to suggest. And rather than having a 10 minutes response, if Emeka and I can engage in a conversation, so you can speak a bit more as well, because the book is great. I think you rushed through it a bit, but I want to tease out certain things that are in the book, but not in the 12 minutes that you took to describe it. So first of all, one thing that I think is great about your book is, and is desperately needed for people like ourselves who engage in China-Africa research, China, Africa, and the US and global research, is the access to actual empirical evidence. A lot of what I've seen, and my focus has turned more on the digital space and digital infrastructure, AI data centers, and what I see being described in academic work, but also like great literature, is just based on the signing of MOUs between a Chinese company and an African counterpart, or it's moral panics related to the deployment of surveillance technology, but the very basic of doing research on the ground, asking questions to African actors and Chinese actors is surprisingly not completely absent. There is still some good work there, but is really overlooked, and you haven't done that. But my question is, the vast majority of people you have interviewed are African journalists, the journalists who have been exposed, employed in Chinese medias, or benefited from training. And what about the Chinese journalists? What about the trainers? At the time of your first book, your PhD turn book, and my book, maybe we were in a kind of a golden age where it was much easier to have access to journalists, diplomats, Chinese diplomats, Chinese journalists, and there was this kind of sense of willingness to to be heard and to explain oneself. And actually, there was a sense of like gratitude for researchers like ourselves who wanted to come and tell not the China story, but just tell the story of what was happening on the ground, why CCTV, CGTN was there, how, you know, just learning from them. And this seems to have been foreclosed completely. Can you tell us a bit more about it, about your second experience, since you had a first experience that from what I know, having supervisor PhD studies, was quite different?
Yeah, I think in this second experience, because I was, the first book was focused on, the experience of African journalists working in Chinese media organizations. Second book is focused on African journalists who are not working in Chinese media organizations, African journalists working in African media organizations, experiencing Chinese influences in those spaces. So it was, even though it was a bit difficult to get to speak to those people who have participated in, funded media training in China, because most of them were skeptical. They didn't want to get into the bad book of the Chinese because they felt that if they speak to me about it and I write about it, the Chinese people will feel bad and will not call them back for another batch of training. So I think that was one of the most difficult. That was why if you read, as you read through the book, you find out that I tried to hide the identity of those people so that they are not known. There's no any way you could identify them, because most of them were very, very skeptical, afraid that if the Chinese government find out that they spoke to me, that will mark the end of their fellowship or their opportunity to go to China. And they don't want that to stop. They want to continue to go to China. That is one of the things that came out of the book. And then I also realized that this is a very, very critical. I remember a particular journalist in Liberia. I got through, and then we spoke, and she agreed she was going to speak to me. Then immediately I sent the questions. She never responded to me any longer. Despite how I tried to tell her to just answer the question that I've sent to her, she never responded, And then I said, okay, I understand. Because she said that she didn't want to get into trouble. I said, okay, I understand you. So I took that as, part of the maybe shortcomings of that project. So I think the difference is that when I did my first field work, even though it was difficult, but somehow I was able to, gain access to some of those spaces in Kenya. But even though most of those work also didn't happen in their spaces, it happened outside of the media organizations in Kenya. I had to go to hotels, to eateries, to conduct the interview. And then I also had to anonymize my interviewees to ensure that their identity was also not disclosed. So I still see that issue of, even though these guys do not work for Chinese media organization, the people I interviewed in second phase, they were also afraid that if the Chinese will get to know that they spoke to me, the opportunities that they have with China will be terminated. I think that's something that strikes me, that in both instances, you have this issue of fear coming up, people thinking that we don't want to lose the source of our butter, on the bread, So I don't know. For the other guys, it was their work. They were working for Chinese-owned media organizations, so it's understandable that they could lose their job if the Chinese bosses find out. But for these guys who were not working in Chinese media organizations, they're being afraid, was I couldn't, understand it, because they don't work for Chinese media organizations, but they were saying, well, we don't want to lose our opportunity of going to China because we get money or go to China. So we don't want to lose that. So I don't think that reflects well with your question.
Right. So I'm going to follow up on this. And so let me frame it this way, because I agree with the core point you made and also you make in the book about, decolonization from the outside is nonsensical, is a non-starter. So things have to happen within standpoint, local places, and engaging with the complex movements that are happening in the place where we live. At the same time, I think we will fool ourselves thinking that the idea of an African Al Jazeera was touted, was put out there in the for decades, and if it didn't happen before with the struggles that traditional media are going through, it's not going to happen now. But is there a third way? And the third way, I see it from the vantage point of universities, less than media houses. Differently from you and Bob, I've never been a journalist. I've just been an academic. But what I do see is a greater sense of confidence in students of journalism, definitely at WITS, I'm sure UJ is very similar, of a sense of assertiveness that probably was not as apparent 10 years ago. There is a sense of towards international organization coming to support the so-called capacity building and so forth. And there is a lot of fight back and say, guys, we are not poor Africans that need your benevolence and to come here to train us. We have our own ideas about what journalism is, how we can affirm at different ways to do things. And definitely in university, the sense of confidence. We have, distinctive localized frameworks. We're relying on more and more, and we don't need something imposed from the outside, being the US or China. I understand from what you're saying there is an economic, financial element there. So people are afraid of losing a stream of funding. But at the conceptual level, I see with my own eyes, young students or mid-careers being much more assertive, much more like confident and rooted in their own ways of doing journalism. And the final point to this is, why are these external organizations, be them Chinese or American or European, not getting it? There seems an attachment to some old paradigms that they don't operate anymore, and a novelty that is emerging from the bottom up that sure is not well resourced in terms of financial means, but I think it's very well resourced in terms of innovation in the way in which we report and we think. So what's missing?
Well, I think the issue is that when you talk about students at WITS and maybe at Rhodes, maybe at UJ, there are also different sets of students when you compare to students in Nigeria, students in other parts of Africa, because of resources, as a journalist in South Africa, hopefully you get a salary by the end of the month, why as a journalist in Nigeria, you're not likely to get your salary at the end of the month. You could work like that for the next 6 months, 1 year. So you see the differences here. So when you look around Africa, you see that there are more journalists who end up not being paid by the end of the month than those who are being paid by the end of the month. So it makes them susceptible to external influence. So they want to dance to the foreign funding organization because they need money to survive. They have to survive, So that's a very, very critical part of the bargain. So in South Africa, you can decide to say, oh, we don't believe, we want decolonization, yes. When we were at VIS, we started this wave of decolonization. But in Nigeria, you have to think twice because you need money. You have not been paid salary for 3 months. You have a family to take care of. You have children to take care of. You have responsibilities. Then maybe start an organization in the US saying, okay, we want to give you like $1,000 to go out and investigate a story. $1,000 in Nigeria, as I speak, is about 1.3 million naira. Why will you not follow Western ideas of journalism? You say that's the best, Or the Chinese people are saying, okay, we want to give an opportunity to come to China to spend 10 months for training, and they're going to pay you $1,000 per month. We sing the praise of the Chinese people. So I think the issue has to do with it's largely economics. When you compare the way it works in Africa, South African journalists top range. They don't need to street talk you to get a salary. You have to pay the salaries by the end of the month. It is not the same in other parts of Africa. In Kenya they pay salaries as of when due, but in Nigeria, in Ghana, not many parts of Africa, salaries are not being paid as of when due. So these are issues that we have to take into cognizance when we discuss these influences from external actors. Because it's only when you are well-resourced that you can push back. If you're not well-resourced, it will be difficult to push back because you need to survive. And survival does not answer to English language. It answers to money. And where the money comes from, you have to follow the money. So that's the way I see it in my own small view.
Yeah, it's sad, but it's true. So Yuni, you're okay. I can pass the ball to Bob, and then if you want to circle it back, since we have a bit more time, happy to, or like opening up to others. Thank you, Emeka.
Perfect. Bob.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emeka, and once more, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
I'll jump straight into it. By first of all, taking note of the fact that we are now at 2026. In the book, you did mention 2006, the 2006 FOCAC, which for the first time took cognizance of the media and communications aspects of the Africa-China relations. So I know that much of the research, and you can correct me, much of your writing was perhaps up to about 2021 or 2022 or thereabouts. And you keep coming to the idea that it's been a decade since China made a big push. So I suppose it will be perhaps, yes, 2012 was a big year when we saw China Global Television Network, Xinhua News Agency, China Radio International, and so forth, either revamp their operations in Africa or make a fast entry, as the case was with China Global Television Network, CCTV, as it was called then. So my sense of periodization is interesting. And my sense is that perhaps you could have gone as far back as 2006 and talked of 2 decades rather than 1 decade. Because you rightly point out the go out, the China journalistic going out, as it were, from 2001. I think that might have been interesting to consider, and of course you can respond to that. But more importantly, if you look at it, I know that we are in 2026, making it nearly 2 decades. One of the things that comes through from the book, although you do not necessarily look at it in those particular respects, is change and continuity. Continuity in the sense that, and I was glad that you are using the theories of framing, of representation, Stuart Hall, encoding and decoding. You are doing content analysis, and as to agree with Eugenio, the idea that you paired content analysis using representation and media framing and qualitative interviews is actually a major contribution. And I want to imagine this will be a required reading in some media studies departments and schools on the continent. So my sense is that there's a potential to look at the longitudinal issues of continuity. And I think one of it that comes through is the split between the perceptions of positivity and the perceptions of negativity. So we can almost agree that this is how Chinese media presence, on the African continent will be for the years to come. In fact, I would like to have your thoughts on that. Is it something we're going to see? Because if you ask Eugenio, Eugenio gave us the idea of development partner, predator, or something else. I think there were 3 strands. Eugenio, remember your own framings of the time. It looks like they're continuing up to now. So should we stop researching these things and say, this is it? Some journalists will be positive, some will be negative, something will be in between. I think taking the mode that Eugenio has established, maybe I'll pose that question to you, then I can, through the chair, Yun. will that work? Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Thank you so much. Beautiful for your insight. The first one you talked about periodization. I agree with you. So I don't have any response. I'll take it as I mean part of the shortcomings. And thank you so much for pointing out that. Then the second part about change and continuity. I don't know. My what I think is that whether it's positive or negative, the Chinese people are interested in getting a foothold in the African media because they believe, that's my estimate, in my estimation, they believe that the media in Africa has been dominated by the West because of colonial alliances and because of English language. And that has also contributed in the dominance of Western messaging, Western framing of China-Africa relations. So they are interested in also gaining that influence so that they could counter what they consider to be Western dominance of the African media narrative of China-Africa relations, So fortunately for them, US aid has collapsed. So which means it will be easier for them to achieve because, I mean, when US aid was here, funding from the US was, coming in. But now there's no longer funding coming from the US because of the collapse of US aid. The EU is doing a bit, but I don't think that has been much compared to what US aid was doing. So I believe the Chinese people will continue to push in the African media to ensure that they gain that foothold to be able to counter what they consider as the Western narrative of China-Africa relationship, which in their own view, they don't like it, So I would say it's going to be continual. They will continue to push. Well, the truth is that from a bit of research I've done in recent times, Africans are also beginning to think, some journalists are also beginning to think, well, why do you have to do watchdog journalism? Why do you have to continue to do watchdog journalism? Who has watchdog journalism helped? I mean, some people I spoke to in Ghana, we need to blend these things. So I think, like I've been written in the past, in the long run, we may have, a kind of a blended journalistic paradigm, with a blending of positive and negative. It will be difficult for it to be segregated, have negative. There will always be the hardcore investigative journalists in Africa, for instance, in Nigeria. If you go to Premium Times, for instance, these are hardcore investigative journalists. They will always be hardcore, and there's what you can do about it. They follow the Western idea. You go to, there are a few of them, but mostly they're online, So these are hardcore investigative journalist platform. They will never change. If China, like China brings whatever they want to bring, those people are not going to change. But now when you come to the mainstream newspaper, these people are most likely to adapt and readapt because of economics, because as the PRC continues to push to bring advertising, some of these media organizations will change their approach to the way they report to the PRC. It might not be approach to journalism per se, but approach to the way they report on events, the political and economic interests of the PRC. That will definitely happen in Africa. So yes, while there may be change and continuity, but this will be, it will be typology of stories. That change and continuity will apply to Chinese political and economic interests in African media. It might not apply to, other issues, when it's reported in the African media. So this is what my thinking is. Like I say, it's a debate. So it could also change tomorrow. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, but okay, Yuan, I can see you have unmuted.
No, Bob, go ahead. I was going to say, please feel free to continue.
I've just two other questions then, or comments come questions. One is, this comes out of the whole discussion throughout the chapters on Chinese propaganda. And the the question I have and my thoughts on these are equally woolly. They are not very well formed. But, you know, I start from the point that the way the Chinese use the word propaganda, sometimes, in fact, they used to have China propaganda department, spelled out in real terms. You know,
Yes,
their understanding of propaganda, at least at that level, it is what we can call public diplomacy or international communication and so forth. The Western and to some extent the African understanding is propaganda is that terrible word of, of trying to influence in negative ways. So I think that kind of nuance, and yet sometimes indeed the Chinese, particularly the CPC, might be interested in spreading notions of communism, socialism with Chinese characteristics, as is often called. But on other respects, it's just to, and I've put it out there, one of the reasons why the Chinese have invested in African media or have done the Chinese going out in Africa is to counter negative narratives and stuff like that. So I think the nuance in the term propaganda seems to me not to have come out clearly. In some respects, yes, it is. I'll tell you a story. You know, when I was a student in China, some of my professors will say, no, look, since you are Kenyan and you're from Africa, why don't we use you to do some propaganda on the continent? They didn't mean that I am going to troll out negative narratives. They said, can you help us explain ourselves? But what is understood half the time is that you're actually going to say, if you're not Maoist, if you're not promoting the one China policy, then you're out of record. So I think there's a bit of nuance there. And related to that is the issue of decoloniality as well. What do the Chinese mean by decoloniality? I think, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this. From what I'm hearing from you, the decoloniality that we talk about on the continent emanates from notions of Afrocentricity, of Pan-Africanism, of the liberation struggles, and so forth. But probably what the Chinese are talking about, and this is again a very superficial reading of your work at this level, I need to read some more, is the Chinese seem to be saying decoloniality from a global south, global north perspective, a broader sense. They are not necessarily talking of helping Africa in decolonizing in the sense of Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and so forth. And of course, related to that is the idea of contra flows. Of course, you cited Tusu and others. I would like to hear your thoughts, because I think the contra flows that that come out clearly on in the book are essentially China and the global south contesting the global north. But there's a sense in which, from the interviews, there's a further contraflow from the African continent contra to the Chinese. I guess I've packed too many ideas there, but maybe you can feel free to respond to any that makes sense. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. Those were very, very important points that you raised, and I agree with you. I think the issue of nuances. I mean, I try to take it from my own understanding of propaganda, and then I just did it as much as I could do. But I agree with your perspective, which I believe that maybe there will be, you never can tell, there could be a second book too, there could be a part 2 of this, so who will develop on that. Then the last thing you talked about the contra South-South flows or South-South engagement between the PRC and Africa, then countering the North. That is how the PRC frames it. That is a South-South, kind of South-South collaboration. But inside the South-South collaboration is is a South, how will I put it? Is Africa versus the PRC. Because, one of the mistakes that, I don't know whether the PRC makes that or other people makes that is to think that China and Africa are operating on the same level. They are not. There's power relations between those two. One is a continent, one is a country. And then in terms of economic and political development, they are in two different levels of economic development. Why the PRC has advanced, and like I pointed out, in China, when you steal money, when you steal government money, you're either shot at or you're sent to jail. In Africa, it's a different ballgame entirely. I also drew on the last Afrobarometer, where 70% of Africans say they prefer watchdog journalism. In China, they don't do watchdog journalism. So these are differences that we must take into cognizance, as we move with the notion of South-South collaboration, which China pushes to convince African political actors, to policymakers, that we are together, but we're not together. That's why the term unequal equals, continues to remain relevant. So China says we're equal, but we are unequal equals, we're not equal with the Chinese people. So, but I mean, in my own estimation, one of the most difficult things is that most African political actors and policymakers know nothing about the PRC. They know nothing about those engagements, They just think, once they hear about PRC, all they think about funding for infrastructure development. So they don't understand, the specificity of that, of the PRC, what they are looking for, why they're engaging with African countries and why they're not engaging. So I think I have said this in several, spaces, and I think one of the things we need to do is to get to train African political actors and policymakers to just have a simple understanding of the PRC, as a kind of behemoth. I think they are this huge behemoth in Africa, playing big. I often say I think the PRC is not bad for Africa, but that engagement needs to be regularized. It needs to be constantly checked by our political actors and policymakers, which is not being done at any level. I mean, I give you the instance of the Chinese satellite TV projects in Africa, for instance, in Nigeria, for instance. I mean, the project was not finished, but the StarTimes has collected certificate of completion from the Nigerian government, and they were celebrating. Nobody has gone to site to check where this project has been implemented, but StarTimes has collected, and the certificate of completion already. This is what I'm talking about in Africa, because people are not doing their work, people are not aware, and people don't care to be aware in the first place. People are just ready once they can get what they can get out of that engagement, and they move on. So I think that is a critical space. Even though the PRC says they are collaborating with Africa, they are not collaborating with us, because we are not on the same pedestal with them. We are unequal equals. So it is the PRC's own economic, political, media interests. They co-opt African political actors into it and use the African political actors, policymakers as bargaining chips, to either get a go at the West. So they co-opt African political actors in order to counteract the West, which I think is problematic, because if they are using you for certain ends as African political actors, you need to ask why. You need to know why you're doing such things. But unfortunately, because that's why I say awareness level is very low. Our actors and the policymakers don't know any of it, are they lack the knowledge of the PRC. Yeah. So I hope this is the most I can say for now.
Thanks, Emeka. May I take advantage of my position as moderator and ask another question
Yeah,
to
sure.
kind of follow up on one of the things that Bob had asked and some of the things that you've just said. And it regards kind of the Chinese media training activities. I mean, one of the important ways that China has attempted to frame its relationship with Africa and African countries is by distinguishing from the Western framing of China and Africa to say, or sorry, China in Africa, right? Is the Western narrative. And in the Chinese narrative and Chinese framing, it's always been China and Africa, China as a partner to African countries. And so I guess I want to push you a little bit on this kind of Chinese media only interested in geopolitical competition with the West, and Chinese kind of media houses really only there to push its own agenda and give a more positive framing of Chinese engagement on the continent. Um, I want to ask about whether or not, in your view, and actually this would go to both Virginia and Bob as well, about whether or not there's any genuine kind of developmental aspect to their training activities, right? And then the part two of that question has to do with Bob's former position at the WITS Africa China reporting project. Um, do you do you guys collectively feel that they've made any influence in terms of their training activities for African and Chinese journalists? One, working together, but two, presenting a more balanced and more nuanced view of what's actually happening on the ground, right? What has been the impact? Because the China reporting project's now been around for over a decade, right? And they've trained dozens and dozens of journalists. Emeka, do you not see any kind of positive influence from those kinds of activities and the kind of teaching that both Bob and Eugenio are doing on the ground? So let me leave it there. And
I
what I'd
mean,
like to do
it's
is go
okay.
back and do one more question each from Bob and Eugenio, and then we'll open up to the audience. And if you haven't already done so, please feel free in our audience to add questions to the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's an important question. No, no, there's certainly positive developments. I mean, I give an example. One participant told me she participated in the 10 months training program. She said when she returned from the training, she was able to buy a car, she was able to build a house. She couldn't have done that if she went to other training. So that's something she looks up to. So she said every time she looks at the car, she remembers this was China. So that lives with her forevermore. And the other person will look at the house he built from attending training program in China. So that's something to be proud of. So these are development. Then again, some of these journalists have also gone up to take up appointments, to gain appointments with government agencies in their countries. So most times when they return from the 10 months program, because they come back and then they're employed by ministries, agencies of government, or Chinese agencies, and then they gain bigger social level in society. So I mean that's something positive to take out of it. But my own question is, in 20 years' time to come, would have had more journalists trained in China than maybe they would be trained in the West. What kind of journalists would there be? Would they be? What kind of gatekeepers, if they're editors, what kind of gatekeepers would they be? Taking into cognizance that Africa is in a special position, we're still developing. We need to critically engage with political actors, our leaders in Africa. We don't need to, bootlick political leaders in Africa. We need to tell them the truth. We need to hold them to such a standard, So if we have more journalists trained in China who are holding, editorial positions in African media, what would that consequence be, for freedom of information, for democracy, and for journalism in Africa? So that's a question which I think those are critical questions we need to engage with, So why it is good, it's positive, but here are critical questions. As much as it's positive, what will happen if we have these? And we have, a few number of journalists who still hold on to the old ways of saying, the politician has stolen money. We have to hold him to account. We have to, write stories about him instead of, bootlicking. So these are issues that we have to take into cognizance as Africa. I always say Africa is in a special position. We're not China. This is Africa. Yeah. Thank you.
Eugenio,
Right.
final comment or question? Yeah.
Yeah, Emeka, this takes you, a bit further away from the book. So you might not answer, but I hope, given the knowledge that you have of the individuals you have interviewed, and you might be able to say something about it. So The question is, in recent years, I've focused more of artificial intelligence in a geopolitical context. So how the competition between China and the United States is perceived here in, well, Africa is 54 countries, but let's say South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, and so forth. So, and especially in the past year, there has been quite a dramatic shift in which China is being perceived for the gesture that it's doing towards the world when it comes to AI, which is open sourcing its model and developing, which is relevant for Africa, but also within China itself. The approach to AI is very different to the approach that is championed by the United States. So in a lot of AI, beyond the LLM, so AI that is used in health, it used in transportation, is systemic, meaning that there is a conscious attempt by the part of the states to use AI as a service, something that sits at the bottom in a structural ways of these different pillars, again, health, transport, and so forth. While in the US is more like a competition between companies that sells their product to whoever has enough money to buy it. And so you end up with like 10% of the hospital having like, the solution from this company and then that other. And so it's much more, parcelized and complex and to turn into a question. So it seems that there is a way in which Chinese actors in a very critical space are not trying to influence directly through a reporting of people, of journalists who access their training, the clear financial incentive that we discussed before. But there is yet another wave of soft power that is coming through these technologies and landing on African soils. And does it have any impact on the journalists you've interacted with? And I think it ties also with one of the questions in the Q&A, but I don't want to steal the question from the person who asked it. So I would leave it at that, but there is a connection there. What are your thoughts?
Well, thank you so much. Remember that in 2025, between May and June, I think that was between May and June, May, July, I had a project that I worked on and I interviewed journalists in 5 African countries, even though it was virtual, but I was comparing Western ChatGPT, generative AI, and Chinese generative AI. And as of the time, things might have changed now, but as of that time, even the journalists didn't know anything about DeepSeek, I must confess to you. It was surprising to me because I was virtually introducing these journalists to DeepSeek. I said, no, we don't know about it. I said, no, just you Google it. So they Google, oh, it's there, true. I said, yeah, so. But they just knew, ChatGPT, Google, whatever. But they didn't know about the Chinese generative AI tool. So, and they were also skeptical, even though while they agreed, they acknowledge that the Chinese one will be more attuned to capturing African lived realities better. But they were skeptical that issues of surveillance and, freedom of information could be hampered, using Chinese generative AI tool. And I was surprised because I said, DeepSeek is very popular. Why don't you know about it? They said, no, we're just hearing it for the first time. But I believe by now things might have changed because this was May, June 2025, about a year ago, so to speak. So I think that many people in Africa are yet to know about Chinese AI tools. It's still very, very limited in terms of knowledge, awareness. And I saw this when I looked at the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Most journalists in Africa don't know what it is. Why? Because the PRCs are, they're not so open. When you go and ask them a question, they're not going to respond to you. So the journalists don't know, except the ones they hear from. Most of them get information about it from Western media, actually, from Western media sources. So even the DeepSeek we're talking about, as a researcher, I was asking them question. Many of them got to know it. If not, they didn't know about it before. So it tells you how unaware people are about this, Chinese AI tools. So I think that is a critical problem, actually. So we need to solve the problem of awareness before, it can become relevant. It can become, not in every country. In Nigeria, yes, people were aware, but in places like Sierra Leone, in places like the Gambia was even worse. Tanzania, even Tanzania has, high level of engagement to the PRC. So these are issues. In Ghana, it's also very, very minimal. But Nigeria was, people knew about it much, compared to other countries. But these are some things that we need to, awareness is an issue. And people are also skeptical about what will happen with it. Would it result to surveillance issues, freedom, So I think the issue of the authoritarian context of the PRC is also affecting how these tools are appropriated in African countries, I believe so. This is my own view, subject to, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Emeka.
Bob, last comment or question or response to my question?
No, certainly the riding on Emeka's just response to Eugenio. I believe your point about the lack of familiarity with big time geopolitical projects such as BRI almost can be confirmed. But my comment then is, does this speak in any way to the long-term, long-running understanding that the Chinese media have not really penetrated the African media space over these years, and flashes of that can be seen in your writing in the new book, such that BRI, even the digital Silk Road, if we can go beyond just the BRI specifically, and because Yun is here, Yun and our colleague, I'm blanking out of the name, came up with this notion of upstairs and downstairs in China-Africa relations. Could it be that the understanding of BRI is more at the elite level, and is not necessarily calculated at the lower level? And tied to that, I mean, you can comment on that. Tied to that, there's the whole thing of African journalism itself. I mean, there is an American, blog which has been running for many years, and it's called Journalism Death Watch. It's like a mortician of journalism, and I think it seems to be happening on the continent. So my query is, why are we focusing on journalism? Maybe I'm being too critical here, but it looks like journalism is dying. I'm on various WhatsApp groups. Hardly do I see the forwarding of any news or information from Xinhua, from CGTN, and so forth. But you see a lot of Washington Post, foreign policy, and so forth. So in a sense, and of course, we also know that Chinese presence in social media spaces, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, is not comparable to Western presence. The attempt by WeChat to launch kind of fell flat. So my big question, therefore, is sometimes are we not fretting too much about Chinese media, Chinese communication more broadly, when it seems to not to have traction when you look closely? And at the same time, at least this question of journalism, conventional journalism as we knew it, losing traction quite a bit. I know this is quite winded, but happy to hear your comment. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful question. Well, I don't think, well, I think we are researchers. That should say why we're interested in what Chinese media is doing in Africa. If we were part of the audiences, I don't think we'd have we may not have such, interest. But because it's already out in the public domain, and as researchers were interested in examining how, it engages with the audience, how it's gaining traction with the audience, that may say why we are more interested in how they evolve in Africa. I don't beyond that. I don't think people are. Will be interested. So that's my thinking as a researcher. Yeah, maybe you could help us here and other people, but for me, that's what I think.
Thanks, Emeka. I'm gonna go to the Q&A. A couple questions from the same person, but I think uh, it sounds like you
Yeah.
all know her. So this is from
Yeah.
Elizabeth Donkervoort. She
Yeah.
unfortunately missed the first 10 minutes, but she is asking how is awareness among people in African countries of the risks of working with Chinese entities. And from her limited experience, there was a perception about 5 years ago that the US and Russia are a risk to countries in Africa, but not in China. So that's her first question. And then follow up is whether or not there are generational differences in the perceptions of China. In places like Canada, you get generations that perceive China far more favorably than older generations. And similarly, they're more dissatisfied with Canada. So she's wondering about the influence of sustained propaganda. So,
Well,
Emeka?
for the first one, yeah, can you hear me right?
Yes.
In response to the first question, I think, yeah, it is true that Africans think there are more risk, but it depends on who the African is and where the African is located in social circle. If it's an African who is maybe an academic, if an African who is a politician or a trader or a policymaker, he or she might think that the PRC is a lesser risk than the US and China. But it all depends on where that person is placed. If it's an African who is a researcher who is aware of those engagement, of the nuances in those spaces, he would consider the PRC to be more of a higher risk than the other actors. So I think it's difficult to just say exactly this is what happens. I would think that depends on where that particular person is located in the social ladder. So if you're a politician who's seeking funding from China, who believes that China is going to bring in funding for projects in Africa, most likely China it will be a better person, a lesser risk than the US. But if you are not, you may have a different perception. So that's my thinking response to that question. For the follow-up question, whether there are generational differences in perception of China, in places like Canada, you get generational perceived China former favorite than older one. Well, I have not done any research in this regard, but I think that just thinking, there's no verifiable data to support what I'm saying. But from my own worldview, I would think that the older generation of Africans or Nigerians are more skeptical about China than maybe the younger generation. Because the older generation were people who they were here when the Chinese factories were violating local labor laws in Nigeria, which they cannot do now. And then because of many products coming in from China now, and the development of high tech from China, the Gen Zs have a very, very positive perception of the PR of China. So I would think so, but I don't have any data to back up what I'm saying. But as someone who belongs to, mid-level, I would think that the older generation would have a more negative perception of China than the younger ones in Nigeria specifically. Yeah, that's what I think. So it has to be different. Yeah. I hope I've been able to answer Elizabeth's question. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your wonderful.
I think.
Thank you for your wonderful question.
Let me contribute to the question, the first question only. And I think increasingly even researchers on the continent in this space want to do risk analysis, risk studies in a comparative way. So any time, not any time, but most of the time when you hear of the risk of Chinese tech around surveillance, around bagging of systems, I think the famous case of the AU headquarters of many years back, a few years back, keeps coming back. But every time the Chinese put up a building everywhere, people are reminded of that. A couple of years back, there was lots of talk around facial recognition tech, and now it's entering into the AI space. From my observation, I see that anytime we talk of Chinese risks of Chinese tech, quickly there's the question of the risk of Western tech, particularly US tech, also comes up. Not long ago in South Africa, I think only last year, you can remind me, Eugenio, maybe you followed this. The South African Competition Commission commissioned a study to look into tech. And the argument being that, big tech, particularly American big tech, was involved in some risky ventures and so forth. The report came out a couple of months back. I haven't quite had a good handle on it, but my initial perusal was critiques not just about business laws, but also the risks associated with some of this tech. And one will recall only recently Elon Musk's satellites. The argument was more of not allowing them because of business, and that's a risk in itself, but also the fact that adherence to South African laws was meant to protect the South African society, government, and so forth from the possibility of data, what it goes through as data colonialism, as it were. So I think where it has come to is almost the geopolitics of tech, in which anytime you raise a risk about Chinese tech, you are reminded of the potential surveillance of Western technologies. I think Eugenio knows this because when he did this book a couple of years back, he pointed out that IBM, for example, was also involved and so forth. But anyway, I thought I'll just state the duality of it, so that, in fact, in some respects, if you talk about the risks of Chinese tech, people argue that you are pinpointing the Chinese only and it's slanted, it is imbalanced and so forth. I think the president of Rwanda put it pretty well, Paul Kagame. He said we are surveilled by all these guys. So it's not either just one and so forth. I don't know where that debate will go in the coming AI and emerging tech area, but I thought those would be my thoughts. Yeah.
And if I can jump in, I also put a link in the chat, I guess it's visible to everyone. And I'm trying to build on what you, Emeka, and Bob said, and also the second question. So one thing, I think that book is great because one thing that it shows is how Chinese actors can be socialized to both national norms, but that happen to be global norms. So what this book talks about is Chinese actors taken on trial by Ethiopian citizen or companies, and first being very offended of the fact that they are asked to respond of their acts in court and say, well, we are bringing development. How do you dare? Don't we get it's called immunity on trial? Don't you see that we are helping you? But then are forced through interaction with individuals, courts, judges to accept the law of the land and behave differently. And this is what you, Emeka, said about certain things were possible before and not now. And you, Bob, also talked about technology. So it seems to me that a stronger legal apparatus that is implemented in practical ways, as it is in Ethiopia, even if courts are struggling, and it is definitely in South Africa, it's different in other countries, can also produce, as a result, a greater willingness and abilities of Chinese technology actors actors, that's what we're talking about now, to accept and behave differently in a way that the US, especially Donald Trump, United States, is not willing to do. And actually, when I'm talking mostly about the European initiative in this space, where an actor like the European Union it's threatening to summon companies headquartered in the United States. The United States is retaliating. China so far hasn't shown this, actually a willingness to be socializing, convinced, and adapt to local norms. And I think this can also have an impact on how it's being perceived. There seems to be in the decades that have characterized this evolving relationship. Also, it's not that China looks better on the global stage, but Chinese actors on the ground are also behaving differently, and this could have a role.
I can also kind of add to some of the shifts that I've personally witnessed. In one of my classes, I offered the option for the students to use ChatGPT to write a preliminary essay on the question of whether or not China is a neo-colonial power in Africa. And over the 3 years that I've offered the option of students either, responding, in a brief kind of argument about whether they agree or not to this statement, or given them the option of using ChatGPT to respond to the prompt and then critiquing the response of ChatGPT. It's been fascinating to me to see how over the 3 years, the ChatGPT generated responses have become more and more nuanced, and more, they're short pieces, so there's not a whole lot of depth, but it really has been fascinating to see. And my takeaway from that is the work that we as researchers have been doing and writing, which is then consumed by ChatGPT, offers those nuances, right? And ChatGPT consumes that and spits it back out, right? So I think there is a possibility of shifting things, maybe marginally and maybe just a little bit at a time. But it strikes me that audiences, especially in places like Nigeria or Kenya or South Africa, where there are multiple media outlets, that they're becoming a little bit more sophisticated or understanding the nuances. And Emeka, I don't think this takes away from your main argument that, Africans need to start kind of thinking more independently, not be beholden to external influences as much. But I do think that they're consuming a wider array of information, and the Chinese kind of positivist stories is part of that. But a lot of it is also, I'm hoping that over 2 decades of scholarly writing, that is also starting to make its way into more media accessible frameworks, right? And platforms, that's starting to have an impact. So I don't know if any of you have any comments on that. We have about 10 more minutes for discussion.
I'm just gonna take any minutes. As you know, I need to dash
Yes,
out,
you need
otherwise
to
we'll be
leave.
locked in the building for the weekend that I can't. My
Yes,
family will be very
please.
disappointed. But thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Mika. And let us know about the next book. So this is number 2. I'm sure there's going to be a number 3 at some point. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Eugenio.
I think Yuna can contribute to that very quickly before, or maybe Emeka wanted to go first. He's the author here, so let me give him the right of fast response.
You go, just take it up while listening. Sometimes you have to sit back and listen to yeah.
No, I think my sense is one of the things that has given African audiences and populaces voice is basically social media. And of all of them, and I don't know if I'm biased or not, WhatsApp is particularly quite interesting. It has just exploded. Emeka, I'm sure you are in 1 or 2 WhatsApp groups where very many arguments arise that of that Afrocentric pro-African, like African agency kind of inclined. And interestingly, this is because WhatsApp is a closed group, encrypted and so forth. They do not get to be amplified beyond the confines of WhatsApp. And of course, because of its nature, people can be very candid about stuff. The current situation of the war in the Gulf is an example in which, for example, people saying, look, what if we try to develop beyond our means now and we get bombed from some quarters? These are arguments. The current war has nothing to do with Africa or an African country, but such sentiments are expressed. When there is, and as I mentioned earlier, when there is contestation on the global stage between US and China, you can see perspectives that are pro-US or pro-China, but increasingly also saying, no, look, we should be talking about Africans developing their own capacity, rather than being over-focused on what the Chinese are doing, what the Americans are doing, what the Europeans are saying. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. I totally agree with you. It should be all about Africa. We should be about developing our own capacities. We should be funding our projects. Why are we not able to fund this training? Why are African government not able to train journalists in Africa? Fund it. Don't you have money? The money that we get from oil and natural resources in Nigeria, is it not more than what the PRC gets from whatever? So, but why are they not spending it on journalists or something else? Must we always depend on China or the US or someone else to fund our journalism? That's a critical problem. So there's this issue of dependence. It continues from colonial dependence. It's still going. It's still ongoing. Because
Africa now has several of its own multimillionaires, right? Including in your own country, Nigeria.
Yeah. But they are private individuals. They're not interested in most of these things, Even if though some of them have foundation, but I mean, they're not interested in funding journalists, sponsoring those trainings. No. So when are we going to start funding, African specific issues, speaking to African problems, African challenges? Must everything come from China or US? We mustn't continue like this for how long? So these are critical issues, I agree. Yeah.
I have one more question in the Q&A. This one is from our colleague, Anthony Nome. He asks, how can we understand China's media influence beyond positive China framing among African journalists? So beyond influencing or attempting to influence positive narratives about China and Africa, how can we understand China's influence on the ethics and practices of journalism in Africa? It's a very good question. And turn it back over to Emeka and then Bob.
Well, for me, I don't know, like, for instance, what I did was ask journalists I spoke to journalists who participated in the Chinese-funded media exchanges. I think that's also one way to, gauge that influence, because when someone has been in China on attended training, you could examine if the person has been influenced by the kind of journalism, his concept of journalism. So, I mean, I saw some of the journalists say, yes, we are no longer, all about what journalism want to do, positive development reporting. That also touches on their ethics, that's what I think. Then when it comes to issues of media partnership and content sharing agreements, in media organizations where Chinese entities have media and partnership content sharing agreements with those local media organizations, you can't critically engage with Chinese political and economic interests. No, you can't do that. So those are the only things I could say. So I don't know if there could be other ways, but this is the one I know for now. Yeah. So yeah.
Thanks, Emeka. Bob, any final thoughts?
No, I think first of all, I'll start by saying that I'm more than convinced that the 20 years later, Chinese media has not risen to what it was built for. Just before I came to this webinar, I was asking people out there here in Joburg on the streets near campus, if they and ask 2, 3 people just to test, do they know about the Belt and Road Initiative? People blanked out. I mean, this is random. 3 people, they have no idea. So, of course, Emeka has talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, the Belt and Road News Network. These entities are taking journalists to China and so forth, but I think their impact is very limited. Therefore, influence is not reached. So I think one lesson we can almost confidently, I mean, okay, let me put it as a hypothesis, is that Chinese media influence on the continent is quite limited. Now, but beyond the idea of influence, one area where influence can be seen, but beyond journalistic practice, is the whole question of modernity. And sometimes it can be couched in positive narratives. And it rides on the fact that the Chinese in the media and communication space have done some very tangible things that the West hasn't done, if you're comparing, for example. So that we are talking of the WhatsApp group that you are in is riding on technology, internet connectivity that the Chinese helped build. And so in a circuitous way, in an indirect way, there's all that area of infrastructure that enables modern communication. And of course, when we hear of the Chinese and their capacity to build chips, computer processing, building of data centers, and so forth, it's not directly journalistic, but it enables modern digital journalism. I think that's what I'll say. Thank you. Yeah.
Any final thoughts, Emeka?
Well, I think, thank you so much for that opportunity. What has happened in recent times is, I think the PRC themselves identified or recognized that the media influence in Africa is very, very limited. Then they took this option of, incorporating the foreign with the Chinese. So, I mean, that's what this book is all about, about the new influence model, where it is not being, permitted through Chinese media organizations, but it's a kind of collaboration between Chinese media organizations and local media organizations in Africa. Because I believe that the PRCs have also examined and realized that their media organization in Africa is very, very limited in terms of influence. So why, instead of relying so much on state-owned Chinese media organizations, why not permit local media organizations? And I think that's what is happening now. So most of the influences go through local media organizations, through journalists, through content sharing agreements. And then, so you see this sanctioned narratives in local media organizations. And you are likely to believe them more because they are being, they are being relayed through a local channel than it is through a Chinese channel. Because if it's through a Chinese media channel, you would want to question it, you want to push back. But once it's from, a local media organization in your country, you would want to accept it that this is true because you think it's, locally generated. So I think that solves that problem for the Chinese people. Yeah, that's what I think.
Thank you, Emeka, and thank you for the presentation of your book. It's available where? Online? Amazon?
Online, yeah.
So
Online,
our
Amazon.
audience members can find the book and get your own copy so you can read in more detail about some of these arguments. Thank you to Eugenio, who had to leave a few minutes early, and to Bob Wakeza, a good friend of the Africa-China Initiative and one of our affiliates. I want to thank our audience members who have stuck with us past the hour, and thank you to our co-sponsors, the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues and the Center for African Studies at Howard University, and especially to African Studies program at Georgetown, which serves as our host organization for the Africa-China Initiative. I want to say special thanks to Eleanor Albert and to Brennan Young and the head of African Studies, Laura Smith, for their support for this program. We have one more event coming up in the spring term. This one is in person. So if you're in the DC area, please keep an eye out on this space, and we'll be sending out more information. But we're going to be talking a little bit more about the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese infrastructure projects, not just in Africa, but in the global South. So we'll have experts from who cover Central Asia, Latin America, as well as Africa to talk about these things. So we hope that, again, if you're in the DC area, you'll be able to join us on Thursday, April 23rd. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here and for listening to this discussion about the new book from Dr. Emeka Umejei. So thank you all again for joining us, and we hope
Thank
to
you so
see you
much.
again soon.
Thank you so much, Bob, for the wonderful discussion. Thank you. I'm grateful.